thing?
Well, it's an interesting discussion. We had it, the bill was in our committee, and we had a hearing on the bill. And there's a couple components to this. There's the actual legislation, and then there is the emotion and the impact of that decision and things that are happening around the nation with regards to the Supreme Court's decision. The bill specifically focuses on the Constitution, right? So it's going to create a new constitutional standard in the state of Maryland. Maryland's different, is unique as opposed to some of the other states, which people have heard about, things happening. I mean, this decision's had a profound impact throughout the country. In Maryland, we have the ability protected to decide on whether to terminate or carry forward a pregnancy. It's right in the health article. There are specific provisions in the health article for regulating abortions. There are, and we'll talk about abortion specifically because that's really what this is going at. There are also provisions in the health article dealing with consent and how old and who can make this decision and when they're ready to make the decision. It also gets into emancipation and things like that. This constitutional amendment would override and change what currently is in law right now. And it's important to understand what's in law right now in Maryland. It protects what the advocates for the constitutional amendment are trying to achieve. So the point is that despite what the Supreme Court has said, there has been no change to women's health services in Maryland. And also, we really didn't get into this during the hearing, but just a couple of years ago, we passed some laws dealing with women's health services where, we changed the individuals who can perform abortion services. We've gone to eliminate copay for abortion services. Funding for abortion service facilities has been, dramatically increased. That just happened a couple of years ago. So the impact of increasing access to abortion services for women's health, that's still expanding right now. That's still taking place. So the impact of that is still in process. Another very important part of women's health is pregnancy centers. And while the Maryland law, the recent laws are taking effect, they did not include any benefits for the pregnancy centers. So that's a separate issue, and it may be a little distracting, but it's a reality because what we're talking about really is women's health. I mean, that's the underlying issue. But so to get back to the bill, we have a situation right now, or the reality right now, what's going on. We've expanded women's health abortion services with these recent laws, and now we have this constitutional amendment. I got my stack of papers right here just in case I slip up and forget. And the way the amendment would work is that all of a suddenly, it's a pretty clear opinion, and a lot of this is conjecture because there's a level of interpretation of how the constitutional amendment will work once it's put in place, is that the existing protections and the existing ability to regulate how the services are performed could be hands-off based off of a constitutional amendment. There's also a concern in the latter part of the wording of that legislation in that constitutional amendment, if it should be enacted, that it may create some new rights or challenges when you get into custody cases. Well, we have the father trying to inject in with the mother. It also includes the word reproductive freedom, which is to my knowledge, is a completely new word as far as legal status, a new phrase for legal status.
Right.
So when you say reproductive freedom, we may be creating some rights and things that aren't even conceived by this legislation and potential constitutional amendment, because that's driven really towards abortion services. But fundamentally, the opposition to the amendment with those concerns is that, abortion services right now in Maryland they're in law, they're protected, and they are expanding based off of the recent laws we just passed. There's going to be a lot of debate about this. And everyone should very carefully read, what's in that constitutional amendment and what the implications will be should it go into the Constitution. Proponents want it in the Constitution. I completely understand that. Proponents don't like it when men talk badly or oppose that. I understand that also. But I just want to encourage everyone to take a look at that language. And remember, once something goes into the Constitution, it's not just proponents that are trying to use it. It becomes subject to interpretation and litigation, and it's very hard to look at it that way. But the wording and the way this constitutional amendment can be used, I've heard this mentioned on the floor where you have to trust women to make these decisions, and absolutely. But the reality is the decision on how that constitutional amendment, that language is used, is not up to an individual. It gets taken to court, and it's going to change things. And I'd urge people to remember what's in Maryland law, and encourage people to remember what's happening right now with women's health services. And I'd also encourage them to remember that pregnancy centers are also very important, because we've got one right here, we've got a couple right here in the district that are doing a lot of work for women's health, but they just can't get some form of parity or link. They don't want to be. They just, it's an imbalance right now. So SB 1 is a response to the constitutional case Bruin, which changed the standard for the validity of some firearm laws, specifically in Maryland, our regulation of wear and carry permits, and the existing part of our wear and carry permit is currently being challenged right now. It's being challenged in the Fourth Circuit, and that's the parts of the law that deal with the HQL, and I believe some of the banned firearms. That's pending right now in the Fourth Circuit. So this legislation was put together in response to that decision, and the goal of it was to create restrictions on firearms. And in essence, what the legislation would do is create certain areas, which were referred to as sensitive areas, and prohibit anyone from carrying a firearm near those areas.
Got it.
This discussion invites over the umbrella issue, which is public safety, right? And when looking at public safety and understanding the implication of lawful gun ownership, firearm ownership, and crime, is that the lawful gun owners are not a threat to society, and they're not a threat to public safety. In fact, the statistics available show that the lawful gun owners are actually an asset to public safety. And that's replete in the testimony. Unfortunately, these are really divisive issues, and it pits one group against another. And at the end of the day, both groups want the same thing. So you've got this statistical information, and then you get into the bill, and the bill creates these areas. So for those who are lawful gun owners, they won't know. There's a high probability they're going to be in a location where they don't know that they violated or crossed into the sensitive area created by the bill. Granted, there are some cases where, obviously that's a prohibited place. But the reality is that this law is going to be questioned in court probably the day that, if it's signed into law, it'll be taken into court. There'll be an injunction issued, and it will be stayed until there's a decision. And most people, even the sponsors in debating it, have predicted that it's going to be held to violate the standard that was established in the Bruin decision. And I totally understand, and I get that there is this focus on firearms specifically being the threat, and it ties into the theory supporting SB1. But the reality is that lawful gun owners are not that threat that seems to be they're being perceived as. However, what we do know is a threat is repeat offenders. And if you go to any municipality and you look at what's happening with firearms and firearm related incidents, it's repeat offender, repeat offender, repeat offender. And our new state's attorney in Baltimore City is the first person I can remember since being in the General Assembly who's come out and actually said, we've got to come up with more punishments. Now, the changes that he's promoting are something that I would support and vote for, but they're pretty insignificant. They're light changes. It changes the mandatory minimum from 3 to 5 years. The Republican caucus, we put together a number of bills to deal with repeat offenders, and this is something that's got to be a priority. And whether you're supporting SB1 or opposed to SB1, you're going to be there. But at the end of the day, everybody's got to focus on repeat offenders. It's got to be addressed. Kind of some of the challenges going on right now in our education system and juvenile justice. This idea that the under 13, the police cannot get involved. We're already hearing about this. We already know of, 11, 12-year-olds punching out custodians, teachers, and you can't suspend them. You can't reprimand them. Well, you can suspend them, but they're not going to be expelled.
Yeah.
There just isn't punishment.
Yeah.
And sure, that's driven by a whole nother set of circumstances, but the reality is these individuals are growing up and they're going to be out. And the idea that there aren't consequences, this concept is wrong and it's taking us down the wrong road. And the sooner we rectify it or come up with a solution, the less painful it's going to be to implement that solution. And I just get this sense where you got two sides circling the wagons, and that is a fundamental major issue that you're going to hear about. I think that's going to be a 4-year debate. I did give you 5 fingers for a 4-year debate this coming session. And look at the percentages of convictions versus incidents. There is a conviction rate that is almost less than a third for a violation. So you wonder why a repeat offender would think twice about committing a crime with a firearm, because they're only convicted a third of the time. Those are pretty good odds.
Yeah.
So currently, the House has already approved its cannabis legislation. The Senate is going to start hearing its cannabis bill, and we'll start voting on it next week. In fact, no, we've already had our hearing. We're going to start voting on it next week. The House took the original bill and it made a number of changes to the legislation before it was sent to the Senate. Fortunately, I'm on the Senate Finance Committee, so I will be deeply knowledgeable on the cannabis law once the final bill has passed. So I'll be part of that voting process in committee. Now, right now, we have stacks of amendments. I've seen them, just from all sorts of different groups and entities. In July or in the last election, the legalization referendum was approved. So it's part of our Constitution. On July 1 of this year, recreational cannabis will be legalized. The reality is that there are laws on the book for public consumption with civil penalties and things like that. Those laws are what govern what a lot of people ask me about. What can I do? Where can I do it? Well, it says no public consumption. What's the penalty? The penalty is that civil penalty. And remember, we've decriminalized a lot in the marijuana use world. What this legislation is really about is how to establish a marijuana industry in Maryland. And how does that industry operate? How does it grow? And how is it made available? And how does it benefit minority communities, particularly those that have been impacted by marijuana in the past. These are new concepts. I can't define a lot of that for you. However, I know there is a concerted effort among some of the leaders in this, particularly in the Senate, to make sure that the law creates a system where Maryland companies can exist and compete in this new market called cannabis and do the things that are intended by the promotion of the legislation. The cannabis industry is a national industry. It's actually international. And there are a number of factors that go into how the industry can operate well and how it may not be able to operate well in Maryland in comparison to these multi-state operators.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll probably vote against the bill. However, I'll vote to make the bill work and work with the leaders to get it to go a certain way, because we've got certain interests here locally that are trying to run a business and do it the way the government asks them to do it. And it's got to be available to them just like it's available to entities in Baltimore City. Yeah, and it's important to point out too, for me to get, what my biggest concern is I really would, and I think this comes in later years. I mean, this is going to be a 5-year process. So we're doing this bill this year. I suspect we'll be back next year doing another bill, and the following year another bill and another bill. But to me, there ought to be some very clear thresholds for children. There also be some very clear thresholds for public information. And I think there's a presumption of a financial windfall for entities that are going to get taxes and fees and things like that. But the reality is, I don't see that. The government's trying to set up a system to promote a legal cannabis industry. But the problem is it's competing with a very strong illicit market. And that illicit market exists right now in large part because of decriminalization, right? So it's like the government's competing against itself. And so in the midst of that, you have local entities and local businesses trying to put something together. Meanwhile, there's another group that says, oh, we're gonna get revenues from this and we're gonna get revenues from that. You'll see me in the debate on cannabis to say, wait a minute, if you want the industry and these industries to survive, if you want to tax them after they're successful and they have revenue making. Don't come right up with these huge fees and taxes. And just stay tuned. There will be a lot of changes, and I think that bill will go down probably till the last, right to the very end of sine die. Sure, that changes the statute of limitations. And so if there's a showing of negligence, if you're an individual or an entity, and you can be shown to have been negligent, and the case is made, you would now be able to bring that case against that entity. That's a very emotional issue, particularly because of the entities that are involved. I'm a member of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church gets, focused on quite a bit because it's a high profile.
Right.
I mean, in essence, so this applies to every national organization. And it is a specific issue, and it deals with sexual exploitation of minors. And the advocates and the individuals involved have pursued this for a number of years. And in order to bring a case, you've got the complainant or plaintiff party has got to show negligence. So it's not a floodgate of cases. Also, financial rewards are capped. There's a cap. Other states have allowed for this. It has brought resolution. There is a showing that many of the people that have experienced this aren't willing to bring it out, aren't willing to pursue their cases. And on the Republican side, there was a split. And I supported this legislation this session, and I also supported it last session. The chief sponsor his name is Delegate C.T. Wilson. He's the chairman of the Economic Matters Committee. previous versions of the legislation, to me, would have created that floodgate scenario where trial lawyers and nefarious types would use this for financial gain. Most of the entities that are involved with this, it has happened years ago. So individuals who are now running the entities are, they want, I believe in my heart that they want this resolved. And if this legislation gets closure for individuals who are affected, improves awareness and ends, this horrific thing, then so be it. I mean, it's a real issue. With what's going on right now in the border and all of these people coming into America that aren't citizens, they are ripe for the pickings for human traffickers and human abuse and some really bad things. And people that are in charge of organizations need to understand that it isn't, there will be accountability. And it was a vote that I was pretty comfortable making. However, it was not an easy one. It was a serious issue. Removing the statute of limitations is I attended law school and I'm a member of the Maryland Bar. The statute of limitations is a very important part of procedure, and it's been there for many, many years, and it's there for a reason, and it serves a very good purpose. However, we have a justice system and there's a balance, right? And we have this group out there that is not getting served. And so to me, this legislation will go a certain way to try to get them some justice.